Awesemo Fantasy Football. Are you tired of the industry consensus? Are you sick of that groupthink mentality? Then try our data-driven approach driven by the world's #1 daily fantasy football player, Alex Awesemo Baker. Alex has loaned his projections expertise to creating our first ever premium season-long fantasy football rankings. Head over to awesemo.com to find out more about our different approach to fantasy football. Now, let's dive into how those rankings would attack drafting from the 105. So the first pick of the 105, pretty easy here, Dalvin Cook. Awesemo's projections say that, especially in half PPR, Michael Thomas is a fine pick when you're looking past pick 4, but essentially you still want to get elite running backs in the first half of your first round. And generally, most of the first round should be taken up by 3-down bell cow running backs. And Dalvin Cook is clearly that. The rumors of his holdout seem to have subsided. He seems to be almost locked in for sure to playing a full season here. So with Dalvin Cook as a clear featured back on an offense that wants to run the football, it makes a lot of sense to go him here. At the 208, this is weird. Miles Sanders doesn't really ever make it here very often. This draft was done earlier in the summer and his ADPs continue to climb, but this might actually be the perfect time to talk about a late second round Miles Sanders, as we've recently seen a Miles Sanders injury scare. He is supposedly going to be perfectly healthy for week 1, and any holdout, any of Sanders getting held out of practice is simply a precaution. But you will see him falling back into the second round, I'm sure, in some drafts. And Awesemo's rankings still have him as an awesome value there. So we move on to the third pick, Adam Thielen. Awesemo's projections, really, if you're going to go receiver in the first 2, 3, 4 rounds, almost demand that you get a dominant wide receiver 1. But the way ADP is shaking out, that is pretty possible, especially with Adam Thielen. He was banged up most of 2019 off and on playing, but in 2018 we saw how incredible he could be operating as his team's wide receiver 1. He posted over 1,300 yards and scored 9 times while catching 113 balls. We saw Stephon Diggs get traded to Buffalo. Justin Jefferson, the team's first-round pick, is still running with the 2s at this point in camp. So Adam Thielen is set up to absolutely smash. An awesome pick here in the third round. At the 408, another receiver. This is an awesome spot to get receivers unless you're going with a handful of alternatives here that we have as the volume-laden but maybe not so efficient running backs like David Johnson, like Le'Veon Bell. But you can typically get those guys in the 4th or 5th round, especially a guy like David Johnson continues to go later than he should. So at the 5th round, we'll be looking to get him. But right now, it's Calvin Ridley. Number 2 receivers aren't typically the choice by Awesemo's projections this early in the draft, but the Falcons are a different beast. I mean, they passed 42.8 times per game last year, and no other team even topped 40. They are an incredible offense to be the number 2 on, so it makes sense to go Ridley in the 4th round. In the 5th round, as projected, David Johnson gets back to this team, and Awesemo's projections simply just cannot get enough David Johnson. He might be the most selected player in this draft series, and it makes sense. We saw Carlos Hyde come into this team after Cleveland traded him for nothing. Jacksonville chose not to bring him back, and he really made no impact in Jacksonville either. And he comes onto this team and posts his first 1,000-yard season. David Johnson has 2 seasons of over 300 touches. He is capable of getting a large role. He's just been ineffective and unhealthy in the past few years, but we saw the same thing happen with Carlos Hyde. He wasn't a special back before he joined Houston. Then he posts his career rushing yard total. When you have Deshaun Watson as your quarterback, his arm freezes safeties. They can't creep up. His legs lock up linebackers. It clears up lanes that even guys like Carlos Hyde and David Johnson are going to get to use, and we know the role will be there. At the 609, Julian Edelman, another volume-based pick. Efficiency or just generally explosive plays aren't going to be Edelman's forte anymore at the age of 34, and Tom Brady not being in the fold, it definitely doesn't help him. But Cam Newton is not an incredible downgrade in terms of where he's going to look to pass. We saw in his final season that he played, a final full season that he played in Carolina in 2018, it was a career low ADOT year for him. He was throwing the most shallow passes he had in his career, and that's what he's going to continue to do as he gets older. As his body breaks down a bit, he's going to take the easy throws, and Edelman gives him that. So really, we just want to get a lot of targets, and Edelman's 153 targets from last year were absolutely absurd. At the 705, Raheem Mostert, another guy who's had a bit of fluctuation in his ADP throughout the summer, given that he did not want to play for the 49ers until he got a bit of extra cash in his pocket. They gave him that, so we can expect him to be playing, and he might not make it to the 7th round anymore. It seems pretty unlikely. But if he were to fall to you at this spot, or maybe even in the 6th round, it's a pretty reasonable pick to make. This draft had the team going pretty receiver heavy in the middle rounds. Awesemo's rankings will oftentimes pick up some running backs there, but it's fine to wait, especially when you get values like Raheem Mostert. Even an alternative pick here was Kareem Hunt, both great values in the 7th round. Going a mix of receiver and running back early like this team did with the first round running back, then hitting receivers multiple times really gives you a lot of flexibility to just scoop up value in the 7th, 8th, 9th round. So that allowed us to get Raheem Mostert, a guy who we saw pop off towards the end of the last season. Maybe a bit of risk projecting him to retain that full role that we saw while Tevin Coleman wasn't healthy, but at the 705, the risk is well baked into the ADP. At the 809, we have John Brown. John Brown, a really interesting player because we saw him struggle so much with health, and then he just comes back like a monster with a quarterback who makes perfect sense for his skill set. John Brown has blazing speed and pretty good downfield route running prowess, getting over top of safeties. And of course, Josh Allen, no better player than a cannon arm player like Josh Allen to get John Brown the ball. There is some risk that Stephon Diggs comes in and takes volume away, but at the 809, that risk is pretty well baked into the cost. And Stephon Diggs, we've seen number one receivers like Odell Beckham switch teams in the offseason, and that has generally been a recipe for absolute disaster, like it happened with Odell Beckham. Now the offseason is truncated to less work with a quarterback that's already a bit erratic, and we could easily see John Brown creep up as a 1B or even 1A option in Buffalo. At the 905, Tariq Cohen, getting back to picking running backs. Keyshawn Vaughn is an interesting alternative. Vaughn is a guy that Awesemo's projections are particularly fond of, given how little we've seen from Ronald Jones and given Bruce Arians' comments saying that they want to get other backs involved. But Tariq Cohen is a pick here because we can lock in production with Tariq Cohen. Tight ends were also an option, but there were still a lot of viable ones on the board. So Cohen makes a lot of sense here. He's posted over 1,100 yards and 8 scores. We saw in 2018, Cohen posted over 1,100 yards and 8 scores. He's a dynamic playmaker, but he's only a dynamic playmaker to the extent his offense allows him. Now this team getting Nick Foles, an upgrade over Mitchell Trubisky. Nick Foles, not a special player, but Mitchell Trubisky 2 years ago was not a special player either. They just need to run a competent offense, and they should get the chance to do that with Nick Foles, and we could see a semblance of what we saw from Cohen in 2018. At the 1009, tight ends started to get a little thin here. We saw a handful of players go before this pick. So on the board left were Jared Cook and Mike Gesicki. This team chose to go Jared Cook. And that makes sense when you think of it in the perspective of we want to tie our tight ends, our receivers, and even our running backs to an extent to efficient and productive offenses with awesome quarterbacks. And you just can't say that right now about Miami. And you can very obviously say that about Jared Cook and Drew Brees. And that showed off last year. Jared Cook, a 10.8 yards per target. He led all tight ends, and his 11.3 average depth of target was second among all tight ends. He was used as a playmaker in an offense full of playmakers. He was getting the ball and doing a ton with it, doing the most with it on a per target basis. And that is both on Jared Cook's athleticism, but it's also just on the fact that Drew Brees runs in an insanely efficient offense. So getting a guy with that type of upside on an awesome offense makes a lot of sense. Cook, a bit of a weekly option, a bit of a volatile weekly option, given that he relies so much on efficiency, which we do expect him to maintain a semblance of. And in the 10th round, it makes a lot of sense. You could still see this team opting for another tight end later in drafts if Mike Gesicki were to make it back to the 11th round, or even a later round stash like a TJ Hawkinson would both make sense for this team trying to get extra stability out of the tight end position. That's going to do it for this draft. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Let us know in the comments what you think you would have changed about this draft or what were your favorite picks. And don't say Miles Sanders at 208. That is such a good pick. I don't want everyone saying that. If you want more awesome content, if you want our rankings, our projections, our cheat sheets, strength of schedule tool, breakout sleepers bust, it is all going on at our draft kit. Go to awesemo.com/fantasy football to sign up and you get all of that. You also get the Draft Wingman, which helps you build optimal lineups for your best ball and season-long drafts. You get all of this just for $29.95. So head on over, guys. Thanks for tuning in.